It was a Thursday, the kind of day that should have ended with a quiet dinner, maybe some laughter over a shared meal. But in a modest home tucked into a narrow street just outside the city center, something else was stirring. Something that had already taken root weeks before, invisible to the eye but steady in its course. The doorbell rang at 6:48 p.m. He hadn't called ahead. He never did. That was part of his charm, always dropping by unannounced, always carrying that boyish grin like it could smooth over anything. His brother had grown used to it, but that evening, as the front door creaked open, it wasn't just his arrival that shifted the atmosphere. There was something different in the way she answered. Her voice held a pause. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. He stepped inside. The house smelled of tomato stew and baby powder. Familiar, lived in, a place where people shared rooms, meals, lives. The kind of place that should be safe. But behind the exchanged greetings and casual jokes, a thin tension hovered. No one said anything. No one needed to. The visitor, David, was the younger brother, a mechanic by trade, hands always stained with the memory of engines. He laughed loudly, spoke carelessly, and loved like a wildfire. Quick, bright, hard to contain. His brother Tunda was his opposite, quiet, measured, dependable. The kind of man who tucked in his shirts and paid attention to expiration dates. And then there was her, Amaka, the glue between them, though none of them knew just how sticky things had become. Dinner came and went. The baby cried. The TV flickered in the background, casting brief flashes of light across their faces. They sat too close on the couch. She reached for the remote and their hands brushed. Tunde didn't notice, or maybe he didn't want to. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the child put to sleep, David offered to stay. The rain had started. He said the roads were bad. Tunde agreed. He always did. But somewhere in the silence of the guest room, as the walls listened and the shadows crept into corners, a decision was made. One that would rewrite everything they thought they understood about loyalty, family, and betrayal. No one could see it then. Not the shape of what was coming. Not the damage already done. The air was still, but it carried something unspoken, something waiting. In the weeks that followed, Tunde would look back on that night with a different lens. He'd replay their words, their movements, the flick of a glance, and slowly he'd begin to question the very foundation of his home. But for now, in that first chapter of Quiet Disaster, all he knew was that his brother had come to visit, and his wife had welcomed him. Too easily. The cracks had formed, but the house still stood. For now. The following morning came with no announcements. The sun rose as it always did, warm, indifferent, reliable. In the kitchen, Amaka stood barefoot, stirring tea. The faint clink of the spoon against ceramic echoed in the quiet. David was still asleep on the living room couch. Tunde had left early, as he always did, briefcase in hand, a kiss on the forehead, a wave toward the baby. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet something had shifted. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It was more like a breath held too long, or a word avoided too often. In the way Amaka lingered near the window, eyes not really watching the street. In the way David walked into the kitchen, shirtless, smiling like he lived there. They spoke in low tones. Too low for anyone else, but not low enough to escape the notice of a house that remembered things. Words like yesterday and waited, and later slipped into the air, coded in something unspoken. The kind of language that only exists between people who've already crossed a line. When Tunde returned that evening, David was gone. He'd left a note on the dining table. Just a line or two about heading back to the shop, needing to check on a customer's car. Tunde read it and smiled. It was just like David. Always moving, never staying in one place long enough to feel the weight of anything. But as Tunde sat down to his meal, he noticed Amaka was quiet. Too quiet. Her eyes didn't meet his as they usually did when she passed him a plate. She didn't ask about his day. She didn't mention the baby's new tooth. She just nodded, hummed, and kept her distance. That night, she slept facing the wall. In the days that followed, David returned again. Once on a Wednesday, then on a Sunday, always when Tunde wasn't home. Always with the same casual smile, the same bold laugh. But now when Amaka opened the door, The hesitation was gone. Her smile came quicker. Her voice sounded lighter. They spoke longer in the hallway. They stood closer in the kitchen. And when the baby cried, David was the one who went to soothe him. Neighbors noticed first. A woman next door whispered to her sister about too many visits, about too much comfort. But no one said anything. Not to Tunde. Not yet. In a town where people kept secrets like heirlooms, what happened inside a home was considered sacred, untouchable. But some things, no matter how carefully hidden, begin to leak. Through gestures, through silence, through the way Amaka started locking her phone, or the way she stopped waiting up for her husband. The change wasn't loud, but it was there, inescapable. And though no one could see the consequences yet, something had already started to take root. Quiet, steady, unforgiving. Tunde still believed he had a marriage, a brother, a life held together by trust. But behind closed doors, reality had begun to fray. It began with a toothbrush, not one that belonged to Tunde or even Amaka. It was green, new, still wet, tucked beside the others in the small ceramic cup by the bathroom mirror. For weeks it had gone unnoticed, or maybe unacknowledged. But on a Saturday morning, as Tunde reached for his own, his eyes paused. He asked once, casually, who it belonged to. Amaka didn't miss a beat. "Your brother," she said. "He must have left it behind." The answer made sense. Just enough sense to be believable. Just enough to allow comfort to settle again. But something in the way she turned away too quickly lingered with him. A sliver of uncertainty. Barely there, but real. Later that day, Tunda stopped by David's workshop. It was a small space near the edge of town. Oil-stained floors, tools hanging like museum pieces. David was hunched over the hood of a car, singing to himself, carefree as always. They talked about work, football, their mother. Tunde didn't mention the toothbrush. He watched instead, the way David avoided eye contact when Amaka's name came up, the way he changed the subject too quickly, the way he laughed, but not from his chest. Something was off. Tunde couldn't put his finger on it yet. But a man learns to recognize the echo of his own doubts, especially when they start to multiply. In the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated itself. More visits, more late returns, more silence at the dinner table. Amaka started dressing differently, less comfortable, more careful. Lipstick that hadn't been worn in months now appeared on idle afternoons. And David, once the brother who came and went, had begun to feel permanent, like a second shadow in a house that only needed one. One evening, while Amaka was in the shower, Tunde opened her phone. He had never done it before, never needed to, but need has a strange way of showing up when things don't add up. Her messages were locked. A new password. Something he didn't know. That alone spoke louder than anything she could have typed. Still, he said nothing. Instead, he watched. Closely. Like someone listening for a leak in the walls. And one night he found it. A slip. A call that came too late. A whisper through the phone before she pressed the screen too fast. She called him baby. But it wasn't Tunde on the other end. He didn't say a word. Just walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood there, staring into nothing. The betrayal wasn't confirmed, but it didn't need to be. The evidence had never been loud. It had lived in plain sight, in toothbrushes, in locked screens, in eyes that no longer looked back. And while Amaka dried her hair in the bedroom, humming like nothing had changed, Tunde stood alone in the dark, finally beginning to see everything. The word itself carries weight, heavy, final, irrevocable. But the moment it arrived, it did so quietly. It started with fatigue. Tunde felt it first, subtle, like jet lag that never lifted. Then came the fevers, low grade, but persistent. He brushed it off at first. Work had been stressful. The baby had been waking in the middle of the night. It made sense, until it didn't. Amaka noticed too, or maybe she already knew. She urged him to visit the clinic. He agreed eventually, not because he was worried, but because she insisted with a softness he hadn't seen in weeks. She even went with him, sitting beside him in the waiting room, holding his hand as they drew blood. 3 days later, the call came. The doctor asked him to return, in person. That was the first sign. The second came in the waiting room, when the nurse avoided his eyes. And then the third, the silence in the doctor's office before any words were spoken. Tunde sat still, calm. He listened as the words were laid out one after the other. HIV positive, stage unknown, further testing needed, time slowed, or maybe it stopped. He couldn't tell. The doctor continued speaking, explaining, reassuring, but the words didn't land. Tunde could only hear one question echoing in his mind. How? He'd been faithful. Always. No slip-ups. No secrets. His life was structured, safe, predictable. Amaka sat beside him, unmoving. Her face gave nothing away. That night at home she cried. She wept in silence, in the bedroom, in the hallway. She said things like, "I'm sorry and I didn't know." But she didn't explain. Not fully, not yet. Tunde didn't ask. Instead, he sat at the edge of the bed, hands trembling, staring at the floor. 2 days later, he asked her to get tested. She hesitated. For too long. Eventually, she agreed. She came back with a folded paper in her hand. Positive. Just like him. But her tears this time weren't of confusion. They were laced with guilt. Tunde watched her, and in that moment, the pieces clicked into place. David. He didn't confront her. Not yet. There was still a hope, fragile and desperate, that maybe it was a mistake, a cruel accident, a medical anomaly. But deep inside, a part of him had already accepted the truth. What lingered wasn't just infection, it was betrayal. The kind that doesn't show up with bruises or broken windows, but cuts deeper. And while Tunde stared at the walls of his home, once a sanctuary, now a cage, he wondered what else had been taken from him without his knowing. The virus was only the beginning. Tunde didn't confront David right away. He waited. Waited for the right time, the right setting, the right version of his brother to appear. Because David had many versions. Charming, reckless, loyal, loud. But beneath all of them, something colder had been hiding. And now, with everything unraveling, Tunde needed to see it for himself. It was a Sunday when David came around again. He brought soft drinks and plantain chips like nothing had changed, sat on the couch, played with the baby, smiled too easily, too comfortably, as if the ground hadn't already shifted beneath them. Tunde watched the way David looked at Amaka. Not the way one might look at a sister-in-law. No, there was something else behind the glance. Familiarity, possession, memory. Later, when Amaka left the room to check on the child, the silence between the brothers grew thick. Tunde turned to him slowly. "Do you have something to tell me?" David blinked. "About what?" There it was, the first crack in the mask. Tunde leaned forward, his voice low, even, steady. "I tested positive. Amaka too." The room went still. David's smile faded. Not immediately, but gradually, like someone realizing the joke had ended and the punchline was them. "I don't understand," David muttered. Tunde didn't respond. He waited. David shifted in his seat. "You think I—" Still no answer. The silence demanded honesty. Then came the sigh. Heavy, resigned. David looked away, stared at the carpet, and when he finally spoke again, the words were soaked in regret. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. A confession. Subtle, indirect, but enough. Tunde closed his eyes. He didn't ask how long it had been going on. He didn't need the timeline. He already knew. It had started months ago, maybe longer. Each visit, each smile, each lingering touch when he wasn't looking. David spoke again, this time barely above a whisper. "She said it was over. I didn't know she had it. A lie, or maybe a twisted truth. Either way, it didn't matter now. The damage had already been done." Amaka returned, pausing in the doorway, as if she could feel the shift in the room. Her eyes darted between the two men. She said nothing, just turned and walked away. David stood up, hands in his pockets, unsure of what to say next. Tunde didn't follow him. He didn't shout, didn't throw a punch. He simply sat back down. His brother walked out the front door like it was any other evening, but Tunde knew it wasn't. This was no longer about marriage, or loyalty, or even sickness. It was about something that had been taken from him, without warning, without remorse. And now a truth lived in the air of that house. A truth that could no longer be ignored. They say silence can be louder than words. In the days that followed David's departure, the house became quieter than ever. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that clings to the walls and watches you breathe. Tunda moved through the rooms like a guest in his own life, haunted by the things he could no longer unsee. The baby still laughed, still reached for his father's face with sticky fingers and wide, trusting eyes. But even that joy felt far away now, like it belonged to someone else, someone untouched by betrayal. The doctor had told him to begin antiretroviral treatment immediately. He'd nodded, filled the prescriptions, swallowed the pills. But it wasn't the medicine that kept him awake at night. It was the question. When did the blood begin to whisper? There had been no warning, no moment he could point to and say, that was it. That was when my life began to unravel. Instead, it had slipped in quietly, through the hands of someone he loved, through a bed he thought was sacred, through trust that had been weaponized against him. Amaka moved carefully around him now. She cooked his meals, folded his clothes, kept the baby clean and close. But her eyes rarely met his, and when they did, there was something there. Not just shame, something darker. Guilt, yes, but also fear. Tunde never raised his voice, never asked more questions. He simply watched, and she too began to shrink beneath that gaze. One night he found her crying in the hallway, not the loud, broken kind, the quiet kind, the kind that slips out between clenched teeth when the body's too tired to hold it anymore. He stood there watching. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer more lies. She only said one thing. I didn't think it would go this far. It wasn't a defense. It was an admission, a surrender. Tunda turned away, not because he couldn't bear to look at her, but because he finally could. And in her face, he saw a reflection of everything they had lost. The marriage, the trust, the certainty, gone. Not with a crash, but with a whisper. The blood held secrets now, invisible but unrelenting. A silent passenger passed between bodies like a secret no one wanted to speak aloud. And though David had vanished into the city, no calls, no messages, his presence remained. Not in voice or footsteps, but in every pill Tunda swallowed, in every drop of blood now marked forever. Some betrayals leave bruises. Others leave a trail in the bloodstream, impossible to trace until it's too late. And still the house stood, quiet, watching. Because sometimes the most dangerous damage is the kind that doesn't scream. It lingers. The town, like most small towns, had eyes everywhere. But they rarely saw what mattered. They saw Amaka at the market, baby strapped to her back, exchanging pleasantries with familiar faces. They saw Tunde walking slower these days, shoulders heavy, but still nodding politely to neighbors. They saw David's empty workshop, doors locked, dust collecting. But they didn't see what lived beneath the surface. Rumors had a way of moving here, yes, but not this one. Not yet. Not the disease. Not the affair. Not the way 3 lives had quietly detonated behind one closed door. It wasn't spoken of, because no one knew. Or maybe they did. There was the pharmacist who gave Tunde his monthly refill and looked at him with something softer than pity, but sharper than sympathy. There was the pastor's wife who stopped by once with soup and too many questions hidden inside a prayer. And there was the neighbor, Mamangozi, who had seen David leaving the house late one night, months ago, with his shirt unbuttoned and his belt undone. She had said nothing. People saw things. They always had. But no one wanted to be the one to say it aloud, because once said, it would become real. In the church, Tunde still sat beside Amaka every Sunday. They held hands during prayer. They nodded during sermons, but their eyes rarely met. They wore the mask well, out of habit or shame or both. The town saw a couple pushing through hardship. What they didn't see were the silences, the tension that never left their shoulders. The nights when Amaka slept in the guest room. The real story, The infection, the betrayal, the quiet destruction of a family remain behind the walls. But truth has a way of leaking. One afternoon at a roadside barbershop, a young man joked that David had left town chasing a woman. Another replied, "No, they say something serious happened in that house. Sickness." The barber laughed, but his eyes flicked toward the street where Tunda once walked with his child. And just like that, the whisper began. Not a roar, not a scandal, just quiet words exchanged in corners. Glances that lingered a little longer. Questions no one asked directly. It was not loud. It was not fast. But it was moving. And as Tunde stood at his window late one night, watching a neighbor cross the street, he knew it had begun. Not because anyone had confronted him, but because the silence felt different now. It wasn't ignorance anymore. It was avoidance. The town had begun to hear. They just didn't want to listen. Because sometimes what's heard in whispers is easier to ignore than to believe, especially when the truth is closer than anyone wants it to be. David didn't return, not for months. His number no longer connected. His social media accounts went dark. His workshop, once filled with the metallic whir of machines and radio chatter, stood silent. It was as if he'd been erased. But Tunde knew better. He hadn't disappeared. He was hiding. And yet one morning, long after the town had stopped asking where David had gone, a small envelope arrived. No stamp, no address. Just slid through the narrow space between the front door and the floor. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was David's. Tunda found it after breakfast. It sat there on the doormat like a shadow waiting to be noticed. He picked it up slowly, as though the contents might burn through the paper. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he sat on the edge of the couch, the letter balanced in his palm. His eyes traced the way his brother still curled the letter T like he had since childhood. It was strange, how familiar things could suddenly feel like strangers. Then, without ceremony, he tore the seal.